Welcome to Inverness, the northernmost city in the United Kingdom, and the historic capital of Scotland's legendary Highlands. Located 150 miles north of Edinburgh and nearly 450 miles north of London, Inverness is one of Britain's most special cities, and well worth the trip from wherever you are in the country. And on this walk around the heart of the city on this gorgeous summer's morning, we'll get a flavour for what makes Inverness so appealing, as we dive into its illustrious history and stroll past some staggering natural scenery, with the city located on the pristine River Ness against a mountainous backdrop. As you might have guessed, the River Ness not only lends its name to the city of Inverness, which derives from the Scottish Gaelic meaning mouth of the Ness, but also to a nearby lake known as Loch Ness. Loch Ness is the source of the river just below where we are here, and it lies just 7 miles away from the centre of Inverness, as do many of its world-famous legends. We'll talk more about Loch Ness and its links with this city later on in our walk, but we begin beside the mighty Inverness Castle, in front of which there stands an iconic statue of Flora MacDonald, a bit of a folk hero in this part of Scotland for the role she played in the rescue of one Bonnie Prince Charlie, the grandson of the deposed King James II of England and Scotland, and the man who came to lead the Jacobite rebellion against the new British monarchy in the 18th century. Pro-Jacobite sentiment was especially strong in the Highlands, and Flora MacDonald here helped Charlie to flee to the remote Isle of Skye after he was defeated and the Jacobite rebellion was crushed at the nearby Battle of Culloden in 1746. And MacDonald, who was jailed in the Tower of London for assisting the rebel leader, has gone on to become a romantic figure of a dramatic period in Scottish history. Over the years, many people have been locked up inside Inverness Castle here too, but the fortress is actually most notable for a number of significant sieges. Located in a strategic position on a prominent mound overlooking the River Ness and the city below, a fort of some shape has stood right here since at least the year 1057, although the current castle, undergoing restoration as we walk by today, is much more modern, built in 1836 after its previous incarnation had fallen into disrepair. Before this building, Inverness Castle found itself under siege on no less than 7 occasions, most notably in 1562, when this castle caused outrage across Scotland. In September of that year, Mary, Queen of Scots, was visiting Inverness, but upon arriving at the castle, its doors were shut in her face. Supporters of Mary then immediately flocked into Inverness to lay siege to the treacherous castle, which eventually fell after 3 days of conflict. Those who had refused the Queen entry were hanged shortly after, while Mary was finally able to enter the castle and stayed inside for a further 4 nights. But the dramatic events of 1562 are just one flashpoint in the action-packed history of Inverness, and as we make our way down off the castle mound, let's now break out a map to see exactly where in the country this riveting city is located. As we mentioned, Inverness is the UK's northernmost city, located just southwest of the Moray Firth, a large inlet of the North Sea. Inverness is today home to just under 70,000 people, making it one of Scotland's smaller cities, but it's by far the largest settlement in the sparsely populated Highlands, and it acts as the spiritual and administrative capital for this legendary part of the world. With gorgeous natural surroundings and, as we have today, occasionally lovely weather, Inverness is renowned as one of the most pleasant places to live in Scotland, often ranking highly in rankings of the country's happiest cities. Here just below the castle now, we're looking up at the Tolbooth Steeple, one of the many spires that pepper Inverness's skyline, and which was built back in 1791. Before the current building, however, the Tolbooth Steeple existed as part of a rather large court and jailhouse complex with roots dating all the way back to 1436. Just across the road from the Tolbooth Steeple, meanwhile, we can see another of the city's most beautiful buildings, the exquisite Inverness House, which was built in 1882. The effective town hall of the modern city, Inverness House is also notable as a place that has hosted events of national importance. Back in 1921, The townhouse was actually the venue for the first British government cabinet meeting to have ever been held outside of London, as then Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who was on holiday nearby, was called into Inverness for an emergency meeting on events taking place in Ireland, and the government's meeting here in Inverness actually laid the foundations for the Anglo-Irish Treaty that brought an end to the raging Irish War of Independence and led to the creation of the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. Of course, that's a history that we don't quite have time to go into today. But how come one of the city of Inverness's main civic buildings is merely a townhouse? Well, Inverness has only been a city in the modern sense since it was granted city status in the year 2000. Although before Scotland became a part of the United Kingdom, Inverness was actually one of the oldest royal boroughs, the equivalent of city status, in the country, having been given the status in 1214, putting it on a par with the likes of Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Stirling. But as we make our way down the Grand High Street here, Inverness is a city that was historically rather unique inside Scotland itself, as a cradle of the ancient Scottish Gaelic language. While Scots, and later English, have been widely spoken in cities across Scotland's lowlands for centuries, Scottish Gaelic was actually the first language of the majority of people in Inverness as recently as the 19th century. In fact, before the union of England and Scotland in 1707, it was said that English was used largely as a language of foreign trade by people here, with Gaelic used for everyday conversation. However, today, just 4.9% of people in Inverness speak Gaelic. So what exactly happened to the local language? Well, to understand, let's first get an idea of exactly what Scottish Gaelic is. A Celtic language closely related to Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic was once spoken right across Scotland around the 12th century. But over time, and due to increased contact with England, the language declined in southern Scotland, but not in the Highlands. The decline of Gaelic in Inverness and the surrounding region was rather more abrupt, coming about in the late 19th century and brought about in large part by the British government's Education Act of 1872, which made English the primary language of instruction in schools across the country. As a result, Gaelic proficiency plummeted from its majority status, although in recent decades, Inverness has been at the heart of a revival of the language, with a number of bilingual signs to be found across the city, and which we'll see more of later on. For now, however, we find ourselves on Falcon Square, on which there stands this rather spectacular monument, the city's new Mercat cross, unveiled in 2003 and standing an impressive 37 feet or 11 metres tall, and topped with a galloping unicorn. As you may know, the unicorn is the national animal of Scotland, associated with purity and power in ancient Celtic mythology, and the animal appears in carvings and sculptures on Mercat crosses right across the country, including also on Inverness's old Mercat cross backed by the town house. As for this new Mercat cross, it stands at the heart of Falcon Square, named after industrialist brothers John and Charles Falconer, who founded the Falcon Foundry Ironworks in 1858, and who were leaders of the city's crucial industrial growth. Historically, being located so far north and relatively inaccessible from the lowlands, industry in Inverness was much different to the rest of Scotland. While a shipbuilding industry existed here as long ago as the medieval era, it wasn't until the 19th century that heavy industry arrived in Inverness, initially centred in this area of the city around Falcon Square. One of the main reasons for this development was that Inverness had over time become better connected with the rest of the country, thanks in particular to the arrival of the railways. And here we've now reached Inverness Station, opened in 1855 and which became a vital artery in linking this once isolated city with the rest of Scotland. The Royal Highland Hotel here, meanwhile, opened 1 year after the station to accommodate those arriving in Inverness after a long train ride. The hotel remains one of the city's oldest and most prestigious lodgings, still greeting passengers who step off the train from far-flung destinations like Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and even London. In fact, the 444-mile rail journey from Inverness down to London takes at least 8 hours, making it one of the longest in Britain. So long, in fact, that there are even sleeper trains which run between the two cities, departing at night and arriving in the morning. When you arrive in Inverness after an epic train journey like that, one of the first sights as you step out of the station will be this statue here, the Cameron Highlanders Memorial. Also known as the Soldier at the Station, this monument commemorates the soldiers of the 79th Regiment who died fighting in Egypt and Sudan. The regiment is named the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and it was one of the oldest in the British Army, with a history dating back to 1793, when it was raised in the West Highland town of Fort William. Now as we move away from the memorial and Station Square, just across the road from us, we'll see another grand Inverness landmark. Behind the big red lorry, which should move in a moment, is the Victorian Market, an ornate indoor market with a history dating back to 1870, when industrial Inverness was on the rise. A symbol of modern Inverness as commerce really began to take off in the city, the Victorian Market has an elegant but dramatic history. For one, the original gaslit market hall was destroyed just 19 years after it first opened, when a fire gutted its interior and spread to neighbouring streets. The financial toll of the fire was significant, but the greatest loss from the blaze was surely that of Inverness's faithful market dog, who proudly guarded A&D MacDonald's butcher's shop inside the market hall. Despite the fire taking hold, the dog remained staunchly loyal to his responsibilities until the last moment, refusing to leave his post outside the shop as the building fell down around him, sadly becoming the only casualty of an infamous night in Inverness. The market hall was rebuilt in 1891 on a larger scale and with more exits to neighbouring streets, and that's the building that remains in action to this day, while a small plaque inside the market also commemorates Inverness's faithful market dog. Now, on a slightly less sombre note, we're making our way off of Academy Street and turning down Queensgate, which will lead us towards one of the oldest parts of Inverness. As you'll notice from the buildings around us, this part of the city near to the station and Falcon Square was developed primarily during Inverness's period of industrial growth, but as we've mentioned, the city has centuries and centuries of history before then. Inverness has been one of the most significant settlements in northern Scotland for at least 1500 years, having served as one of the main strongholds of the Picts as far back as the 6th century AD. Today, very little remains of the Pictish settlement here at Inverness, although traces of an early medieval church and other artefacts have been found where the city centre exists today, while to the west of central Inverness, you'll find a large and rather picturesque forested hill known as Craig Fadrig, where the Pictish King Brude once resided in a fort, the outline of which can still be seen at the summit. Now the fort at Craig Fadrig was also said to be the site where the famous medieval Saint Columba arrived in Inverness to convert the Pictish king and his people to Christianity, during an important turning point in local history that also saw the supposed birth of the legend of the Loch Ness Monster. We'll talk more about St Columba and the Loch Ness Monster later on, but we've now arrived onto Church Street, where we find Abertarff House, the oldest secular building in Inverness, dating back to 1593. Originally built as a townhouse for a likely wealthy resident, Abertarff House has served many purposes over the centuries, acting as everything from a bank to a private home and a local cultural centre. But most famously, this small house was at one point home to the Fraser of Lovat family, one of the most powerful clans in this region of Scotland. Of course, as we head away from Abertarff House now, the existence of clans was historically significant in Scotland's Highlands. But what exactly is a clan? Well, the word clan derives from a Gaelic word meaning children, and it refers to a group of people with a shared identity, although a clan is not necessarily synonymous with a family. As we pass by the King's Highway pub, so called in reference to an old medieval name for this road here, clans may have been based around family lineages, but many non-relatives would also take a clan's name so as to show solidarity with them. and the Fraser of Lovat clan was a major force in both Invernessian and regional politics, with the clan wielding great power here until 1746, when they fought alongside Jacobite rebels at the Battle of Culloden and were defeated by the British government. But interestingly, the clan's impact can still be seen to this day, with the surname Fraser being the most common in the area around Inverness today. Now, just along Church Street here, we're passing by another of Inverness's oldest buildings, Dunbar's Hospital, which was built in 1668 and originally used as a charity hospital. But what's even more interesting about Dunbar's Hospital is that it's said to have been built from the stone of a citadel built a few years earlier by Oliver Cromwell. After Cromwell's victory over King Charles I in the Civil Wars, he decided to cement his authority as the new Lord Protector over every corner of his Commonwealth. The Highlands, which had been predominantly pro-royalist during the conflict, were a key region for Cromwell to maintain control over, and so over 5 years in the 1650s, an immense military compound, known as a citadel, was built just north of where we are now, intended to be on such a scale that it would overawe the locals. And the citadel was completed just a few years after this building we're passing here, the old Gaelic Church, which was built in 1649 as a church for Gaelic speakers. Of course, with pro-royalist sentiment still present in this part of Great Britain, the Highlands were the scene of a number of anti-Cromwell uprisings after he took power, and particularly after Scotland was absorbed into his Commonwealth from 1654 onwards. The fortress must have been a deeply intimidating presence on the edge of town, with the citadel large enough to house 1,000 troops, all ready to crush any opposition at a moment's notice. Soon after Cromwell's death in 1658, however, the citadel was demolished, its stone used for the construction of other buildings around Inverness, like Dunbar's Hospital, and so the only evidence of the citadel's former existence can be found in a street named Cromwell Road. An old landmark of Inverness that does still stand, however, is the Old High Church, which we can see towering above us here. The building in its current form dates from around 1770, but the site on which it stands is thought to have been used for worship for far, far longer, as the place where traces of that early medieval church were found. That puts the origins of the Old High Church at around the 6th century AD, when Christianity first came to the Pictish stronghold of Inverness. The spread of Christianity here marks one of the most important turning points in the history of Inverness, brought about by the arrival of the Irish monk and missionary St. Columba. Now, as we mentioned, Columba sought to spread the gospel among the likely pagan Picts of northern Scotland, and the successful conversion of the Pictish King Brude here at Inverness was a major step in the development of this city. Today, the long history of religion is more than evident when walking around Inverness, with the city's skyline dominated by church towers and steeples, including the imposing Free North Church here by the river. Situated right next door to the Old High Church, the Free North Church was built in 1893, and with an impressive spire that reaches over 52 metres or 107 feet into the air, it's the tallest building in central Inverness today, having taken the title from its neighbour, the Old High Church, which was so named as it once soared high up above all else in Inverness centuries ago. Both churches are located right by the River Ness, which is crossed here by the Greig Street Bridge, built in 1881, and which is notable not just for an eye-catching design, but also for its rather springy suspension, with the bridge locally nicknamed the Bouncy Bridge. While the gentle wobbling and boinging of the Bouncy Bridge can make for a rather odd sensation as you walk across, do take the time to stop and admire the River Ness itself, in particular, the crystal clear water that you can see flowing directly underneath you. And I really do mean crystal clear, an almost entirely alien sight for a river running through a major British city, particularly for someone like me from all the way down in London. Of course, as we mentioned, we're just 7 miles away from the river's source at Loch Ness, an icon of the pristine Highland countryside, which is a spectacular landscape that's also renowned for its many beautiful natural springs, which provide some of Britain's purest drinking water. And here in central Inverness, owing to the city's proximity to those springs, the tap water is particularly pristine, the kind that you'd pay an arm and a leg to get in a bottle elsewhere in the country. But of course, the waters of the River Ness here aren't only known for their purity, but also their unique wildlife. Now interestingly, according to a little-known local legend, the waters of Loch Ness at the river's source are home to an enormous, centuries-old monster, known as the Loch Ness Monster. Through history, sightings of this mysterious beast that lives just up the river outside Inverness have been reported, and once upon a time it's said that the Loch Ness Monster actually lived in the river much closer to where we are now. There's a lot more to that story, however, and we'll talk more about Nessie as we walk along the river. But having now made our way across the Ness, we find ourselves outside Balnain House, built in 1726. One of the earliest town mansions to be built in Inverness, Balnain House was also rather notably used as a field hospital during the Battle of Culloden, but surprisingly, not for troops of the Jacobite armies which had strong support here, but rather for soldiers of the British government, who went on to defeat the Jacobites on the battlefield just 3 miles to the east of Inverness. But the Battle of Culloden, while arguably the most famous, isn't the only significant battle to have taken place in this vicinity. Way back in the 11th century, a battle was fought between Scottish and Norwegian forces at Balnain to the west of Inverness. Now the Norwegians, who at the time controlled part of Scotland's far north, were likely seeking to expand their dominion further south, and the battle just outside Inverness was a big win for them, giving them important territorial gains while also dealing a crushing blow to the Scots. Now although Balnain perhaps isn't the most well-known battle in Scottish history, the clash just outside the city shows us another side to the long history and significance of Inverness. Walking along the western bank of the River Ness now, and we can see how the city's skyline is dominated by church spires, with historic religious buildings found all over central Inverness. Opposite the densely packed city centre across the water from us, this side of the river is also home to a number of interesting churches, such as the one that we're passing by now, St Mary's Roman Catholic Church, which was built in 1837 and designed to serve what was then Inverness's modestly sized Catholic population. There were around 400 Catholics in Inverness around the time of this church's opening, but among them was none other than the Lord Lovat, the chief of Clan Fraser of Lovat, who helped to establish St Mary's and later worshipped inside. There are even more historic churches to be found around Inverness, but a short walk down the river from here, we'll also find Inverness's Cathedral, which is the northernmost active cathedral on the island of Great Britain. We'll get there in just under 10 minutes' time, but as we continue along the gorgeous riverside, let's return to the legend of the Loch Ness Monster, and where it first emerged. There are many different arguments surrounding exactly when the first sighting of Nessie was, but the earliest estimate is around 1500 years ago. The story goes that Columba was told tales of men being attacked by a water beast in the River Ness. So, Columba then ordered a follower of his to swim across the river to attract this monster. And when it inevitably appeared, Columba stopped the monster in its tracks, and banished it down the river to Loch Ness, where legend has it, the monster still roams. Countless more sightings of the Loch Ness Monster have been recorded since the turn of the 20th century in particular, but the mystery has never been truly solved. If you are looking to visit Loch Ness and maybe even see the monster for yourself, then Inverness is a great starting point for any trip, with direct bus services operating from the city centre every day to the shores of Loch Ness, all reachable in under an hour's drive. And beyond the enthralling mystery of the monster, the scenery at Loch Ness is truly spectacular, with gorgeous villages like Fort Augustus and the amazing ruins of the medieval Castle Urquhart among just a few of the highlights a few miles down the river from here. Still, there's no denying that the riverside views in central Inverness are some of the loveliest in Scotland, particularly from the bridge that lies ahead. Ahead is the Ness Bridge, the main route across the river in central Inverness, opened back in 1961. Of course, the current bridge wasn't the first to have crossed the river here, as it was built to replace an older, bouncier suspension bridge opened back in 1850, although that bridge, pictured here, eventually had to be replaced as its narrow road proved a major problem for traffic in the city. That suspension bridge was only built after a previous 17th century bridge collapsed in flooding in 1849, and so it's clear how both sides of the river here have always been places of significant settlement in Inverness. Now looking towards the north from the bridge, we can see the River Ness as it flows towards its mouth and the Beauly Firth, where it enters the sea just a mile away from where we are now. Spinning around and looking upstream, however, we can see Inverness Castle, where we started our walk. Towering over the river in that strategically high position we mentioned, the castle is notable not just for important historical events like the Siege of 1562, but also for a rather famous literary association. In the classic play Macbeth by William Shakespeare, Inverness Castle serves as the setting for the pivotal moment in which Macbeth murders King Duncan, after which point he takes the power of the crown, but begins his dramatic and infamous descent into madness. Shakespeare's play is of course based on the real King of Scots, Macbeth, but not all of the events in the play are entirely accurate, with the murder of the real King Duncan, a historical truth, actually thought to have taken place nearer to the town of Elgin, just over 30 miles to the east of Inverness. No record remains of what occurred at Inverness Castle at the time, and it's possible that the real Macbeth may have been long dead before the castle was even built. But despite the likely historical inaccuracies, Shakespeare's play speaks volumes about the heritage of this great city, and it's also a link that draws many literary fans to Inverness and to its castle to this day. Now, we're continuing upstream alongside the River Ness, beside which we find two of Inverness's grandest hotels. The Columba Hotel, built in 1881 and of course named after the Celtic-era missionary, offers some amazing views of Inverness Castle, while its next-door neighbour, the Palace Hotel, was built in 1890 on the site of the old Ness House, a grand old riverside mansion. The old Ness House was destroyed in 1870, and so the Palace Hotel was built in its place as Inverness sought to cater to a growing local tourist industry. Of course, after the coming of the railways in 1855, Inverness and the Highlands became far more accessible than ever before, shortening the once arduous trip up from Edinburgh into a matter of hours. Ever since, Inverness has been able to bill itself as the gateway to the elusive Highlands, with equally sought-after destinations like Loch Ness and Scotland's far north, Caithness, John O'Groats and such, all within easy reach of the city. In fact, speaking of John O'Groats, if you fancy something a bit more challenging, then Inverness is the starting point of an epic long-distance footpath that runs for 147 miles all the way along the coast to John O'Groats, located on the very tip of the island of Great Britain. Now, John O'Groats is a little far for us to walk today, but after nearly half an hour of strolling around the centre of Inverness, I hope you'll agree that we've got a real flavour for what makes this city really worth visiting, with its illustrious history and gorgeous scenery. But now, we're reaching the end of our tour around Inverness, which will finish beside the shallow and calmly flowing River Ness, in the shadow of our final landmark of the day. Here on the southern edge of the city centre beside the river is the most northerly active cathedral in mainland Britain, Inverness Cathedral. Built in the late 1860s and dedicated to the Scottish patron saint St Andrew, the cathedral belongs to the Scottish Episcopal Church, and notably, it was the first Protestant cathedral to be built in Scotland after the Scottish Reformation of the 16th century. Of course, with the growth of the city's population as industry rose in the late 19th century, the cathedral provided an important new place of worship in Inverness, and a symbolic religious home for the Highlands as a whole. Interestingly though, the growth in church attendance after the cathedral was built here, in turn actually reinvigorated congregations at some of Inverness's older churches, such as the old High Church back across the river, whose dwindling congregation was revitalised into a healthy community in the later years of the Victorian era. Local growth in general was immense at the time, with Inverness's population almost doubling in size between 1851 and 1901, although, along with the effects of the Education Act that we mentioned earlier, the influx of people from across the country was another reason for the rapid decline of the Gaelic language here. But with the traditional language undergoing a revival, and ever more visitors making their way to Inverness to discover its incredible heritage, there are few better places to explore for an in-depth introduction to Scotland's world-famous Highlands, and the thousands of stories to be found in the wild countryside. Sadly, however, we've run out of time to explore the many more stories that the wonderful city of Inverness has to offer. But no matter where you are in the world, this once isolated Highland city is now easily within reach, and absolutely worth the visit should you get the chance. From the legends of Macbeth to the Loch Ness Monster, the history of its castle and its enthralling city centre, Inverness has so much to offer, and I really hope you've enjoyed this tour, as we've just about scratched the surface of the city's history. But as we now reach the banks of the gloriously pretty River Ness once again, that brings us to the end of our walk around Inverness. Thank you for joining me.